Testing.
That's it.
Okay, hello, and thank you for coming. We have a nice group. And anyone who is expecting free martinis, I'm sorry to disappoint you. I lied.
There's no free sushi.
Okay. I worked on this project because I feel it's valuable for my children, grandchildren, and great-grandchildren, and cousins.
Talk right into the mic.
Oh, okay, sorry. All right, and my cousins, to know the history of our family based on evidence and records relating to events during World War II and post-war. Members of our family engaged in efforts to ensure that justice and the Constitution would prevail for future generations. Growing up, I learned most of my history from my aunts. I think my parents chose not to burden me with their painful memories and outrage. My self-esteem and future was positive with many opportunities. As an adult who has participated in the American dream, I am glad that I have learned about the courage and tenacity in the face of hardships, prejudice and obstacles that I know that my parents experienced. I know that I come from good stock, although my mother was always reminding me that we probably had a horse thief in the family. So the title, I had to think about the title, and I chose The American Family Story. I will briefly talk about the internment camps where my parents met, a couple of Supreme Court cases. My uncle had the first one during the war. The 442nd and 100th Battalion and the Military Intelligence Service, which my father and uncles served in. A congressional bill, reparations, which my Aunt Mary had a large part in helping to obtain, and congressional medals that my uncle got, and a term paper. My grandparents immigrated to the U.S. in the 1890s. Only first sons could inherit property in Japan, and women had few opportunities for education. The Japanese were intrigued by the democratic ideals and opportunities. They settled on the West Coast and were successful farmers and businessmen. In 1941, Japan bombed Pearl Harbor on December 7th. Fear and widespread, baseless beliefs that the Japanese citizens were espionage agents led FDR to sign the Executive Order 9066 in February, declaring that 117,000 Japanese Americans, most of whom were citizens, will be evacuated to designated war zones to prevent sabotage. The camps were constructed in isolated areas. The War Relocation Authority rounded up over 110,000 people. People had 6 days to dispose of pets, belongings, and property. Curfews were imposed along the West Coast for Japanese Americans. This sent shockwaves through the Japanese communities, and a couple of quotes. To us who had faith in the Constitution of the United States, it was a profound shock that our citizenship did not matter and that rights guaranteed under the Constitution would be so easily taken away without due process of law. To us, this evacuation of a minority group seemed to have violated the Bill of Rights. We were determined to accept the order with the full realization of the crisis which threatened the democracy of the world and a sense of responsibility common to all free men. These sacred American privileges and national welfare were at stake. We realized that the best interests of a few sometimes had to be sacrificed for the good of many. My parents' families were successful farmers, and some of the family owned a hotel in Seattle, Washington. They, along with other citizens, were housed in temporary locations when the order was issued while they were building the internment camps. The Tualatin Valley Fairgrounds, Pacific Livestock Pavilions, the Santa Anita Racetrack. One of my best friend's mother was housed in a stall in the Santa Anita Racetrack. There were food shortages, lack of sanitation facilities, and a lack of privacy. People were put on trains and transported to the camps. They had no idea where they were going or what to expect. And the map shows the holding centers, and then in red are the 10 permanent camps. And they're all kind of in very isolated, desolate areas. There were 10 permanent camps holding between 7,000 and 19,000 internees. I'm familiar with most of them. Hart Mountain is a very famous one. It has a big memorial center. Most of the camps are kind of either cactus or dirt or something now. My parents were in Minidoka in Idaho. When there's duplicates in a state, probably one of those camps was used more like a prisoner of war camp than an internment camp. Milton Eisenhower had been appointed to lead the war relocation effort, but resigned after 3 months, protesting the incarceration of innocent citizens. The camps were located in isolated, desolate areas, barely fit for human habitation, lacking adequate heat, decent food, and privacy. Some violence and deaths occurred when people tried to escape or got too close to the barbed wire fences. My mother said that the military left them alone and did not mistreat anyone that she was aware of. They were always conscious of the presence of armed guard towers. In Arizona, the Bureau of Indian Affairs placed camps on 2 Indian reservations, which was protested by the tribal councils to no avail. In Hawaii, 157,000, a third of the population was of Japanese descent. My uncle was in Hawaii. Martial law was declared for 3 years, but the military command refused to take the undemocratic way to deal with the Japanese American residents. They were treated with respect and humanity. This won their grateful and ardent cooperation, and they produced 90% of the food and played leading roles in defense and other occupations during the war. Only 1,037 residents were evacuated, although it was anticipated by the Army and government that there would be many more due to the large Japanese population. On the East Coast, there were individual exclusions of Italian and Germans thought to be conspiring, but no mass evaluations were planned. Residents in California, Oregon, Washington, and Nevada did not want the evacuees to return. 2/3 thought they should be sent back to Japan, even though they were born in America and had nothing to do with Japan. The evacuation cost the government millions of unnecessary expenses and robbed the country of millions of work hours. Canada, Mexico, Peru, Brazil, and Argentina evacuated their Japanese population to the U.S., but the U.S. deals. This is a he's a cousin of an uncle. His name is Gordon Hirabayashi. He had the first Supreme Court case during the war. He refused to go to the camps, and he refused to obey curfews that had been imposed. He was imprisoned in Arizona and helped build the road on Mount Lemmon. If you've ever been to Arizona, Mount Lemmon is a wonderful recreation site. He was imprisoned there while waiting for the Supreme Court to hear his case, and he was the first case to be heard, and they only listened to the part about curfews, where he was being imprisoned for that part of the charge. They did not comment on the legality of evacuating citizens. They ruled that curfews were a necessary part of the war orders, but would not rule on evacuations. It was clear that the constitutionality of evacuations was difficult to deal with. In the 1980s, the conviction was overturned when the Supreme Court found that the government had suppressed findings that Japanese Americans on the West Coast were not a threat to national security. There is a campsite and recreation dedicated to him in Arizona. And I recently, 2 years ago, my friend said, you know, when you come, we have to go to this campsite up on Mount Lebanon. She said, it's dedicated to Gordon Hirabayashi. And I said, oh, I'm related to him. So we went up, and it's really a lovely site, and the display tells his story. Now this next slide is it's a calendar of when the 9066 order was issued, where they were holding people until they finally got into, this is for Camp Minidoka, when they finally got to the camp, and it's part of a yearbook that was the only yearbook, hardback yearbook that looks like a high school yearbook that was published during the war. There were several paperback things from other camps, but this one was a hardback and looked just like a high school yearbook. There's a picture of it. We have one of the only copies of the original. It is now, I guess, over 80 years old. And the man who edited it, when he got his, I think he died before the reparations were issued, but his family spent the $20,000 reparation money to have this published and sent to all the schools in Oregon and Washington State. So the yearbook is based from 1 year, 1942 to 1943, and it depicts camp life. And it's similar to a high school yearbook in that there are activities and divisions and photos, but it was far from being a high school yearbook. And the two other books came from Camp Topaz and Camp Roar in Arkansas. Tom Takeuchi was the director of activities in the camp, and he edited the introduction and all the text in the book. He did not want history to forget or ignore what happened. In the 1980s, it was reproduced, and his family used the reparations to distribute it to the schools. Director Harry Stafford, who obviously was not Japanese, wrote the opening remarks for the yearbook, and they're quite remarkable. He was a very enlightened administrator who describes the winds of war and vultures of hysteria and greed who deprive the people of their liberty and property, and he praised the internees as strong folks for their struggle with adversity. Tom Takeuchi, the editor, believed in the ideals of democracy, and the book is dedicated to the hope and faith that the future would bring a better America and the land of liberty, equality, and justice. Now, the book is set up into divisions. Okay, you're right. Administration, employment, schools, finance, health, legal, supply, postal, welfare, religion, stores, agriculture, and engineering. They were like small cities. There were 44 blocks where residents lived in barracks. And this is a map that shows the location of all the places I just mentioned. Even had a police station and a hospital and offices. Okay. These are the barracks, quite drafty and crowded and not without privacy, and it looks like they're sitting in a lot of mud. And then the next pictures, am I? Yeah. Oh, divisions, okay. All right, so the book is divided into divisions, just like you'd have a junior class and a senior class and a ninth grade class. And they have all the blocks, and we were able to find my mother's family. I think my grandfather was off either interpreting or working for Sun Oil. We did not find my parents because they had left by the time these pictures were taken. My parents only spent 9 months in the camp. My mother was determined to get out of there quickly and go on with her life. We found my aunt's family. My father's family is in one of the blocks, and I can actually see them. And these are pictures of the blocks. This is my parents' block. And of course, everybody kind of looks alike, so it's hard to I'm going to skip to activities now. There were lots of activities in an attempt to really have a normal life, especially for the children. They had a parent-soldier association rather than a parent-teacher association. They had semi-pro softball, basketball, band, choir, arts and crafts, entertainment, variety shows, queens and sweetheart dances. They celebrated July 4th and Christmas. And there was an exhibit at the Renwick that I'll briefly talk about later where they gathered all the arts and crafts from all the different camps. And it was a beautiful exhibit at the Renwick. And this is the Postal Service and Maintenance Divisions. Now, as the government realized the error and illegality of the evacuations, people were able to leave the camps if they were married, if they had guaranteed employment on the outside, they could leave for military service, or if they had ill health. Some in Congress were not satisfied with wholesale evacuations and continued to criticize the War Relocation Authority for pampering and coddling the evacuees. They demanded liquidation of their citizenship. The military in 1943, first they weren't allowed to serve, and then in 1943, the military decided they needed men. They wanted 4,500 troops from the 10 internment camps. Only 1,000 volunteered, including my father. My father was very patriotic. In Hawaii, where the Japanese population did not lose their basic rights, 10,000 people volunteered. These troops formed the 100th Battalion and the 442nd Combat Group with a military intelligence group, the most decorated for lengths of service in the war. My parents were married and left camp in 1943 to come to Washington, D.C. My mother got a job with the War Relocation Authority, very pragmatic woman. The department that put her in the camp. My father joined the Army. There's a picture of my father. And the next sheet is this is from the book, the 442nd Combat Team. There are movies and documentaries about this very decorated team. One of the movies is called Go for Broke. It's been around for a long time. It's a pretty accurate depiction of what they went through. In 1945, there was another Supreme Court case, and the Supreme Court decided that the U.S. had no authority to subject conceitedly loyal citizens to leave procedures or evacuations. They waited a day before announcing their decision in order to give President Roosevelt a chance to close the camps. In 1946, the year I was born, the final camp was closed. Japanese Americans were determined to fight against Japan and preserve democracy and destroy racial prejudice. They were determined to prove their patriotism, serve their country. They were equally outraged against the attack on America, and the segregated 100th Military Battalion and 442nd Combat Team that were formed became the most decorated for size and length of service in the U.S. military during World War II. They wanted to restore their rights and resume normal life. By the end of the war, they had support from many in government, the armed forces, students, journalists, religious, social, and labor unions, and organizations. And President Roosevelt was singing a new tune. He was saying that Americanism was a matter of mind and heart, not race or ancestry. Hysteria and misinformation, fears of sabotage and racism caused the creation of these camps. Japanese Americans lost daily family life, businesses and professions, savings and securities, rights and privileges. They still had their citizenship and faith that democratic ideals would prevail in the future. Many evacuees believed that obedient, quiet cooperation would prove their loyalty and sacrifice to the war effort. That the evacuation was a mistake from the standpoint of humanity, not only constitutionality. That assimilation, once on the outside, would let them be recognized as equal citizens and allow them to work towards correcting the grave injustices. Racial segregation, living in crowded camps without privacy or conveniences, or decent food, little income, or liberties, caused others to lose their pride, self-confidence, and initiative. In 2000, we made a video of my mother, and she described her experiences, and she was willing to talk in 2000. She was, I think, 80. She described her experiences and her conflicting emotions about the camps. She says that if she had to be in a concentration camp, she was glad it was in America because they were not mistreated. She was grateful for the opportunity to come east and work for the government. She said her opportunities would have been very limited if they had returned to the West Coast in Seattle. And it's ironic to hear her thoughts. It was ironic to hear her thoughts about the camps in light of what went on in Germany and Japan. The older generation of Issei, or first generation in the country, they were not born in this country, they were the immigrants. The Niseis were the second generation, but born here. They all processed the trauma of the war with traditional values, which encouraged putting the past behind you and enduring with dignity, which is called gaman. And Shigatsu Ganai is something where things can't be undone. That was their mantras. Even though their lives, careers, and businesses had been upended, they were not interested in a government handout. They did not talk to their children or friends about the embarrassment and shame of being in jail/camps. Now, the Sanseis, which is my generation, the third generation, we were born in this country in the shadow of the civil rights movement. And we saw the camps as another form of racial oppression that needed to be spoken about, against. And the Sanseis worked through the Japanese Citizens League, Japanese American Citizens League, which is an organization that was established in the 1920s. It's the oldest Asian civil rights organization in the United States. And it was established to secure and safeguard the rights of Asian and Pacific Islanders and all communities affected by injustice and bigotry. Now, the Sanseis and the Nisei, the two generations, argued and disagreed for quite a while, but they finally came together in the belief that they had an obligation to uphold American ideals. The message was not about them, but it was about a constitutional issue and the future of this country. Reparations. In 1976, President Ford repealed the executive order that had put the Japanese in camps. In 1978, John Taitishi, director of the Civil Rights Redress Committee for the Japanese American Citizens League, led the campaign for reparations along with many JSCL organizations in major cities, including New York, where my Aunt Mary was president and very instrumental and successful in lobbying the government. She called me in 1988, 10 years later, and asked me to pick her up at Union Station and take her to the White House, where she was going to be part of the signing and apology. After 10 years of campaigning, 40 years after the last camp closed, President Reagan signed the Civil Liberties Act that apologized and granted reparations to internees. $1.7 billion was the estimated loss. The passage of the Civil Liberties Act was a way of having Americans recognize the injustice and ensure that it would never happen again. It was not about monetary gain, but that the Japanese Americans had not been guilty of treason. After 9/11, the Japanese American Citizen Leagues warned about identifying an enemy and fearing specific ethnic groups who resembled the enemy. And their saying was, fear overcomes reason very easily. So this is President Reagan signing the Civil Liberties Act. My Aunt Mary was at that signing. She's not in the picture, but she was there somewhere. In 2010, President Obama signed congressional legislation approved by Congress that awarded Congressional Medals of Honor to the Japanese American soldiers from the 100th Infantry Battalion and the 442nd Regional Combat Unit and the Military Intelligence Service, where 19,000 Japanese Americans had served. It was a lottery. My father had died the year before. I was hoping that he would at least get his name drawn. But my uncle got a Congressional Medal of Honor for his service with MacArthur. He was an interpreter with General MacArthur. This is a picture with President Obama with 7 of the surviving veterans. And my father's dear friend is to the, well, he's on the right of the screen, to the left of President Obama. We love that picture. We love this picture of him with President Obama. And I found out recently that the Congressional Medal of Honor service was held, I think, in the Capitol. I think it was in the Capitol. And John Boehner, the House Speaker, awarded the medals to people. This picture is of Senator Daniel Inouye. He was in the, I'm not sure whether he was in 442nd or the 100th. He lost his arm, became senator, and my Uncle Saab and my Aunt Mary were there at the ceremony. And there's a special medal designed. It's called, let's see, there's a name of it. Yeah. It's the Congressional Gold Medal, U.S. Army's 100th Infantry Battalion, 442nd Regimental Combat Team, and Military Intelligence Service. And I recently called my cousin because he has the medal, and I said, you better keep that safe, you better not lose that. So, many thanks to my grandson Patrick for his invaluable help with this project and his interest and curiosity about the internment camps. I don't know how many of you out there can do a PowerPoint presentation, but I can't. So it's like, Patrick, please. So he prompted me when he was going to do a term paper his freshman year in college, and I didn't know my recollections and information were kind of scattered, so I thought, well, I better find out. And he said he would like to visit the site of Camp Minidoka and do some sturgeon fishing while he's out there in Idaho. He's a big fisherman. So one final note. My parents were both inured at Arlington Cemetery, because they're running out of land so they have a place where you put urns. And after the ceremony, there happened to be an exhibit at the Renwick Gallery called The Art of Gaman. And that was the arts and crafts collected from the survivors of the camps. Gaman means to endure with dignity. And the art represented the internees' efforts to maintain their normal lives during their imprisonment. And when we were there, the docents realized that my two aunts were in the camps, and they rounded them up and asked them to speak to the audience that was there. Both aunts felt very honored to make comments. And there are many resources now on the camps, and there are documentaries and films and books. And, so I wish my parents were alive to see all of that. Thank you so much for coming.